Last week I told you about four main ways that God uses trials and pain in our lives. And here they are again. To establish a relationship with us, to mature us spiritually and emotionally, and transform us into who He wants us to be. And then to equip us to do what it is that He wants us to do. And finally, the other one was to show us how much we need Him and how much we can trust Him. And to be clear, these four ways were not meant to be an exhaustive list. They're just to give you an idea of some of the main ways that He uses trials and pain, because there are other ways for sure. Okay? So, after telling you this information, you might very well ask a question like, how do I know all this? And how do I know this is how God uses trials and pain? And how do I know how He can be trusted through our trials and pain? And the answer that I want to give you... Went too far. There we go. Boy, this thing works too good. Stop. There we go. The answer is I know from experience. So just like when I started the series that we did, the extensive series that we did on science and how science emphatically shows that evolution is not possible. So when I started that, I gave you my credentials of why I'm qualified to speak on those matters of science. Well, today, I'm basically doing the same thing. I'm going to give you my credentials for why I'm qualified to speak on the matter of emotional pain. And it's right here. Because it's experience. Because I've lived it, and I'm still living it. So one of the things I want to do today is I want to take a few minutes to give you some insight into some of my painful experiences. Because I've always struggled with two things: anger and depression. To the point of spending literally the first part of my life pretty much every day thinking about how I just wanted to die. And there was one time that I attempted to accomplish that feat. All of that was really difficult during the 80s. I had a number of things that happened in the 80s that were difficult, including the passing of my mother. But all of this really came to a head in 1996. In 96, I went through a series of painful events. And the first one started with my first wife leaving me. And soon thereafter, I broke my right hand. And then I lost my transportation when my truck died. Boy, that's a whole story in itself. But anyway, I lost my transportation. Then I lost my position of leadership on the evangelism ministry at my church. And then I ended up losing my church and a lot of my friends there. And then to make matters worse, my finances were a disaster as a result of going through a divorce. And then the final, I guess, insult, if you will, is when my dog had an accident and she broke her back and she ended up a paraplegic. All these things that I just shared with you happened in less than 4 months. So it's not what you would call, it wasn't what you would call a real good year. And as you can imagine, struggling with anger and depression, I was not a very happy camper because of all this. And I struggled mightily in these areas. And I, again, made a lot of unhealthy choices during that time in my life. I always like to say that I never felt so lonely and alone at the same time, because the two are actually different. And I spent a lot of time thinking about how I just wanted to end it all. But the thing is, in spite of how much I wanted to give up, God would not give up on me. He led me into a new church. And at that new church was where I met my late friend and mentor. I went too far again. Bob Poskett. There's Bob. I showed you this picture a few months ago in another series. But there he is again. There's Bob. the wisest, most compassionate man I have ever known in my whole life. Bob led a biblically based support group for men who were going through divorce. And I started to attend that group, and that group, with God working mightily through Bob, transformed who I am. And it happened as God through Bob started to replace the lies in my mind with the truth. And as a result, I started to see my situation in a different light, that being the light of God's truth. I began to see that there was actually a reason why all this pain came into my life. God had a plan for it all. It had to do with putting me in a place where I could pass along to others the same truth that I have learned so that I could help them. And let me give you some examples of some of the ways that, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But in addition to that, that realizing that there was a plan for it, the other thing that God did was that He personally took the time to meticulously show me how much He loves me and how much He cares about me. So this is what I want to give you a couple examples of. During 1996, I told you I had a lot of financial problems. However, every month, through various means, the money came in to pay my bills and to eat every day. And so during all that time, I never missed a payment. I never got late on anything, and I never missed a meal. And because of that, one of my favorite verses has become this, Psalm 37:25. It says, I was young, and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken, or their children begging bread. I literally took this to mean I was going to eat every day. And God has never let me down on that. And you know, money has actually continued to be an issue for us. In fact, there was a time when things got bad, so bad for our family that we might have literally been out on the streets if it wasn't for family who took us in. This was just a few years ago. People like Mike and Ty, who's Tiff's sister, and their family, who took us in for over 2 years because we didn't have a place to go. So, with that, I'd just like to say, imagine having me in your house for over 2 years. That's a scary thought. That just gives you some insight into how wonderful Mike and Tiana are. And then there's Colonel Roy and Betty, Tiff's mom and dad, and all the ways that they have helped us over the last few years. And in my family, and the way that they've helped me as well. But bottom line is, we still never had to go without. We never had to sleep outdoors. We've never been without a change of clothes. We've never not had a place to wash every day, and we have never missed a meal. Now, please understand and realize, do you know that over half the people in the world cannot say what I just said? So, here in this country, to make a statement like that, that means that might seem kind of minor, but to the rest of the world, those simple things that I just said can be absolutely huge. So the bottom line again, God has always provided. It may not have been the way we were expecting, but He always provided. And let me tell you another one. God provided transportation. When I lost my transportation in 96, not one, but actually 2 of my neighbors let me borrow their cars. We worked out a little schedule, so I always had transportation getting back and forth to work, etc. And how about now? Because we have just the one car. And I work here at this school. Tiff and the boys are at their school. So all last year, transportation, to say it got a little hectic at times, would be a vast understatement. But this year, my principal generously came to me and gave me one of the school vans to drive back and forth every day. So, our transportation issues in our current situation, God has provided for that too. And then here's the story I want to tell you that about God's provision that most people seem to love this story the most. One day back in 1996, I'm out trimming my bushes, and my hedge trimmer's broke. And I was not very happy about that. Plus, I literally didn't have the money to buy new ones. And I'm not talking about anything fancy here. I'm just talking about the manual kind that look like a great big pair of scissors. So I'm not talking about anything fancy. Well, the next day, I'm driving to work, still complaining to God about my situation and how I couldn't even afford to buy new hedge trimmers, which really maybe $20 or so, right? Okay. And let me tell you, I was making sure God could hear me. I was driving with my head out the window, yelling at God in my complaints because I didn't want the roof of the car to interfere with his reception of my complaining. As the words of my complaining were loudly coming out of my mouth, I saw something in the road up ahead, and I had to slow down. And when I got up to it, lying in the road, up ahead were these hedge trimmers. Can you see that? Hedge trimmers. So here's my question. All of you, in all your combined years of driving, has any of you ever come across hedge trimmers lying in the road? You know, I've been asking that question for 21 years, and I've still ever had anybody say yes, which just goes to show how miraculous it was that God put them there just at the moment I was complaining about not having them. Well, I sat there and looked at them for a while, just like, you gotta be kidding me. And then I finally realized what happened, and I got out and picked them up, and then I both thanked God and spent some time asking for forgiveness for all my complaining as well. And you know what? These were a lot nicer than my broken ones, too. When we moved back to Maryland a couple years ago, I took my family to that spot in the road and showed them exactly where they were. And then, another story, God provided stamps. Back in 1996 again, with all my financial troubles, one day I go to the post office and I'm excited because I have the money to pay my bills. I go in and I realize I don't have enough money left over to buy stamps. So I come back out of the post office feeling kind of dejected about that. And when I got back to my car, lying on the ground next to my car was this, a book of 20 stamps, lying right there next to my car. Just like with the hedge trimmers, I have no doubt God put them there just when I needed them. And if you look in here, I never used the last one because I wanted to keep it as a remembrance. And stamps were a whole lot cheaper back then, by the way. I told you my dog had her accident. Well, God spared my dog, and He provided something else for her, too. So when she had her accident, it not only left her hind end paralyzed, she also couldn't control her bladder or retain her urine. So as you can imagine, that's a problem, okay? She spent the next week after her accident at the vet hospital. And I remember this like yesterday. I used to go there before work and right after work until they would close the place down and kick me out. My dog was a dachshund, so they had her in a small cage. They wanted her immobilized. So I used to grab a chair, open up her cage, and just lean in with my head and shoulders as much as I could get in there and just sit there and hold her. Because I knew what was coming, right? And at the end of the week, the vet told me they had done all they could for her and I had to make a decision. And this was not a decision that I wanted to make. So I told the vet, I understand, but I just can't do it right now. I'm going to go home. I'll come back tomorrow and give you my decision. So I went home that night feeling about as low as I have ever been. But then that night, actually in the middle of the night, she woke me up. My sister Julie called me, and she was all excited because she said for the first time in her life, she knew what it was like to have God speak to you because God has spoken to her about something. And I was excited for her just for that. But then she said, but here's the cool part. God's telling me to tell you to go to the vet tomorrow and bring your dog home because it's all going to be okay. Well, after that, I got to be honest, I just turned into a crying mess after that. But I was like, okay, that's great news. That's what I'm going to do. Because you see, at that time, my dog was like the only constant I had left in my life. And I just couldn't imagine losing her. So the next day, I did just that. I went in and told the vet what happened. And she started crying. All the vet techs were crying. And I was crying again because we all went through this together. They were absolutely wonderful people. So I brought her home. And then within a week or so, my dog actually regained the ability to retain her urine. But if she's paralyzed, you can imagine that creates a new problem. Getting it out, right? Releasing it, because she didn't have control over that. Did you know you can express an animal's bladder by just knowing how to grab it and squeeze it? Yeah, I didn't know that either. But guess what? I know now. And in fact, I spent the next 7 years doing that for her. I had the only dog around that peed in the toilet. I bet you didn't expect to be talking about urine today, did you? But God didn't stop there. So the vet told me about this place that makes these wheel carts for dogs. And they look really cool. But at $200, they were more than I can afford. But then 2 friends of mine, Tim and Janine, blessed me with the money to buy one. I still have the letter that they gave with the money, dated 4/21/96. They actually wrote it like from their dog to my dog. So, what's that? He wants me to read it. All right, I'll read it. I was saddened when I heard the news about your back. I understand you're getting along a bit better now, and I learned about your new wheelchair. That's what the money is for. So you'll have more money left over for doggy treats. Call me if you want to play sometime. Love, Bert. You happy? I just didn't think you'd be interested in it, but well, I like that. I appreciate your interest. They had a boxer. I think it was a boxer named Bert. So anyway, they were wonderful people, and they blessed me with that money. Anyway, so my dog spent 7 more years zipping around in this. Can you see that there? And here's a picture of her in it. Shotzi was her name. And yeah, she made me get vanity plates to go with it too, right? Okay. But I'm bringing this up too at this point. I'm going to show you because the story doesn't end here, because I want you to see in this picture, see those wheels? Those are not these wheels, are they? 2 different sets of wheels. Because there's more to this story that I want to share with you. A few years later, I got a job in the research department at Shriners Hospital for Children in Tampa, Florida. So we moved from Maryland down to Florida. Now Shriners has about 20 hospitals or so throughout our country, and they focus primarily on helping kids who have orthopedic issues and kids with burns. And let me just say this. They are an absolutely wonderful organization. They do some amazing things for those kids, and they never charge for it. So, it just so happens that their location in Tampa was one place where they actually custom designed and built all the ambulatory devices that the kids in their hospital needed. So whatever a child's issue, and whatever surgeries they might have had to go through or whatever, they custom designed and built an ambulatory device, and some of those things were amazing looking, but specifically fitted for that child so they could get around in whatever their situation was. So one day, seeing all these cool things they built, one day I thought, I'm going to bring that in and show them. The guys that make these, they might think that's cool. So I brought that in to show them, and they said, yeah, this is pretty cool. But you know what? We can make it better. By all means, I told them. So I gave it to them, and you notice the original cart had little plastic they're basically toy wheels. And you see now, we got rubber wheels on there. They took this thing, added more padding to it, and they redesigned this back here that they said this would be would be better shock absorbing. So I come out with this basically modified wheel cart now. So my dog could not only go on a flat surface, but now she could go four-wheeling. And this thing really helped her go over different surfaces too. So anyway, God provided, then He provided even further by putting me in the right place to receive what the folks at Shriners helped me out with. And then there's another story I want to tell you about one of our birds named Whistle. Here's Whistle. We have 3 birds, well, mostly Jacob, but there's 3 birds in our home now. Whistle is one of them. We don't clip any of our birds' wings because we like to let them out and let them fly around the house. Well, one day back in 2006, Whistle was out sitting on Tiffany's shoulder, and someone came to the door. She forgot Whistle was on her shoulder. She went to answer the door, and unfortunately, Whistle took off. So we were living in Chicago, well, a little north, in the Chicago area at the time, and the first bit of good news here is that it was in the summer. If it had been in the winter, she wouldn't have lasted very long. Even still, she flew off, and she took off, and she was gone. Now, you might notice she's bright yellow, okay? We lived in an area that had tons of birds of prey, especially hawks. So in essence, this bright yellow bird is flying around basically saying, with a sign on her to those birds saying, "Eat me." I mean, something like this is not natural around out there, right? So there's a number of things stacked against us in this situation, and you could say our chances of getting her back are pretty much slim to nil. Well, after looking for a long time and coming up empty, we decided to make posters and put them up around the neighborhood. And then the next day, Jonah, who was 7 at the time, says this: "I know we're going to get Whistle back, but God's telling me we're just not the chosen ones to find her." And that's exactly the way he said it. And then after 2 days, as she flew away, we get a phone call from somebody saying that they found our bird. She flew over a mile away and landed in somebody's front yard, and we ended up getting to know them later. And the folks looked out in the front yard and said, "That's got to be a pet." They went outside. Whistle flew right to them. They took her in. They happened to have an aquarium, put her in an aquarium, gave her some food and water. And then like a day and a half later, they're driving around the neighborhood going to garage sales. And they saw our sign. And they called us, and we got whistled back. So again, God provided, and even told Jonah about it, what he was going to do before it even happened. And then, of course, there's Tiffany. God brought me Tiffany. Back in 1996, while I was going through my divorce, a good friend of mine, Rhonda, invited me to come to church with her. I went to church with her on December 15th, 1996. This was 3 days prior to my divorce being finalized. So I got divorced 3 days after I heard this message. And just before her pastor started to preach, Rhonda turns to me and she says, "This one's for you. So you need to pay good attention, or pay close attention and take good notes." So I did. And her pastor preached on Isaiah 61, 1-4 that day. And here are those verses. It says this: "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They'll be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. They'll build the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They'll renew the ruined cities that have been devastated for generations." And among a whole litany of things, one of the things her pastor specifically said was in the next calendar year, we were to expect an abundance of joy. Joy that would include things like joy and a Christian wife. That's what he said. I wrote it down and I turned to Rhonda and I started laughing and I said, "I'm not even divorced yet, and he's already got me remarried next year." But 3 months later, on March 29th, 1997, I met Tiffany, and we got married on November 8th, 1997, in the next calendar year. And all of you folks know Tiffany, and you know how wonderfully she is and what a blessing she's been. As I always tell people, I married a whole lot better than she did.
That's good.
Yeah. And there's one other story I want to tell you. One other story about a way that God provided back in 1992. So, as most of you know, I spent over 30 years competing in the sport of powerlifting. Those are meets where you go, you do 3 lifts: the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. And that was something that I actually became pretty good at and something I absolutely loved to do. Well, back in 1991, 8 days after accepting Christ as my Savior, I'm training to go to the Midwest Regionals, which was a qualifier for the Nationals, and I'm doing my last squat workout before the meet. And I was supposed to do a set of 3 with my weight that night, and I did my first 2 reps, no problem. On the 3rd rep, I'm coming up, and I tore all the adductors in my right groin. I don't know if you guys have ever torn a muscle before, but the closest thing I can compare it to, if you had a guitar, took a knife and cut one of the strings, and the strings would spring back away from the point where you cut it, could literally feel that inside going on in my leg. It's just the weirdest thing. Anyway, needless to say, I lost all my strength and went face down to the floor. Now, the guy spotting me prevented any other serious injury because they were able to move quick enough to redirect the weight that it didn't totally crash on my back. But with that, I had a serious problem with my right leg that didn't heal. And because of that, I spent the next 10 months going to physical therapy. And after that time, my leg was still not healed properly. And I was unable to really, I always tell people I couldn't put one plate on the bar anymore. I just couldn't lift anything anymore. And I was not very happy about that. I also had my walk, I had a bit of a limp too. But this is something that I love to do, and now I can't do it anymore. And like I said, I was not happy about that. And about that time, my dad called me. I was a grad student at the time, and my dad called me, and he said he started watching this guy on TV named Pat Robertson on this show called The 700 Club. He said, I kind of like this guy, you should check him out. So I started watching him, and I kind of liked it, and I started watching regular too. And I noticed at the end of their show, they would often have a time specifically of prayer, time of prayer specifically for healing. They would pray, and then God would speak to them about miracles that he was doing, and then they would relate that on the TV. And to be honest with you, as a relatively new Christian, I wasn't too sure what to make of that. I wasn't sure if these gifts of the Holy Spirit were still around because, sadly, you can find far too many people today who tell you that they're not. And then one day, as I'm sitting there watching this show, Pat starts describing my injury in detail. Then he starts describing my lack of progress with physical therapy. And then he said, God is healing your leg right now. As soon as he said that, I felt an intense sensation of heat in that spot in my leg. So much so that I jumped off the couch. I thought something was on fire. And I'm literally like hopping around the room, like trying to get away from it. And then after about a minute, it subsided. And then I'm standing there, and I'm thinking, what in the world just happened? Like, are you kidding me? Is this for real? And then the thought pops in my head, I know how I can find out if it's for real. I went back to the gym the next day, started training again, started doing everything I used to do, regained my strength. And that was 25 years ago, and I have never had any problems with it since. Not only that, the 700 Club also came out and interviewed me. They did a story of my healing, and I ended up on their show in April of 2007. And let me just say here, if any of you struggle with that issue about the gifts of the Spirit, that's actually two of the messages on our YouTube channel that I spoke about that. I highly encourage you to listen to that if that's something that is an area of confusion for you. So anyway, I told you all these stories today because I want you to know from experience, I know that God cares about your tools, your transportation, your pets, your health, your friends, your need for support, your spouse or your need for a spouse. I could do this all day, on and on and on. Whatever it is, God cares about it. And I have learned from experience that the truth is God is a God who cares in personal and specific ways. But here's the beauty of all this. God doesn't just care. He cares so much that he'll step in and do something about it, to the point of performing a miracle if that's what you need. And you know what's so cool is that when things are at their worst for us, and it looks like it'll take a miracle for us to get through our current situation, that's when God does some of his coolest stuff, right? So whatever your need is, God cares about it. There we go. Whatever your need is, God cares about it, and he can be trusted to provide for it. So regardless of your situation now, your situation in the future, or anything in between, the truth is, God truly cares about all your pain, all your trials, and all your needs. And think about this. God cares about us so much that He cares whether or not we have stamps. And He'll provide them if you need them. Think about that. Stamps. I mean, what kind of love is that? Well, that's what that is love that's so great that the Father sent His Son to die for you. And please understand this, because not only did He do that, He did that when He saw you at your worst. Take a look at Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates His love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And Paul writes in Romans the following: who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Please understand what this means. On your worst day, in your worst circumstance, on your worst, in your worst pain, in your worst suffering, you simply cannot be separated from God's love. Please understand that and grab a hold of that. But here's the thing. In your spiritual battle, remember I told you in this series we're going to talk about spiritual warfare? The devil will do everything he can, no holds barred, to lie to you and to try to convince you otherwise. As I said a couple weeks ago, that's hell's agenda for your trials and pain. But that's not God's, and it's not mine. So before I finish today, let me end by pointing out something critical. Everything I shared with you, please understand, this isn't just about me. This isn't just for me. Because God can and will. Did I go too far again? This thing works too good, like I said. God can and will do the same thing for you. If you allow God to work His process of transformation in you, if you give Him control of your life, if you surrender it to Him, you can learn from the experiences of your own trials and pain. You can learn. Went too far again? Getting too heavy-handed. There we go. We got it. You can learn how much God loves you, how much God cares about you, and that He can be trusted to provide for all your needs too. So what I was trying to do today, my stories were meant as an encouragement for you guys. And these things that I mentioned about giving God control, surrendering, I already mentioned spiritual warfare. These are all topics that we're going to address as we go through this series. So, finally, let what I shared with you today, let that be an encouragement to you in your own situations. And then we'll pick it up from here next time.